beyond the scope of what our governments and NGOs can do. Organizations, profit and nonprofits, have an opportunity to do something about it, and their stakeholders are increasingly asking that they do so.
Corporate responsibility and corporate citizenship requires three things. Number one, make money. Number two, make it ethically. And number three, make a difference. And it's that context when we think about corporate responsibility, CSR, citizenship, sustainability, whatever title you want to put on it.
The business community, I think, needs to stand up and explicitly defend business and defend free market capitalism. Business is the best engine of value creation. Business provides useful products and services to its customers. It creates jobs, creates prosperity, pays taxes.
If corporate responsibility were dangerous or irrelevant, I don't think we would see boards of directors increasingly focus on the topic. And if it were dangerous or irrelevant, I don't think we would have seen companies maintain and in fact extend their commitments to corporate responsibility even during the greatest depths of the recent recession.
Corporate responsibility, sustainability is widely seen as complementing what governments do, never as a substitute, and that's very important, and that is a valid point. It should not be used and seen as a substitute, because today's world is very different from 20 years ago. Business has gone global. Going global means going local everywhere, means coming to grips with very different regulatory environmental regimes.
I think if you label CSR or citizenship or sustainability as a philanthropic activity, then I agree, that's misguided. It is about the core of what the business does, how it does it, ethical and effective business leadership.
Campbell is one of the 7 core business strategies of the company. It's there not because it's nice to do, although that's good. We want to make a positive impact on society. It's there because it makes the company better, right? It builds employee engagement. It attracts the best talent. It lets people know they can put their passion to work at that company.
A problem for me from the business perspective of the whole corporate social responsibility rhetoric is it can, and I think this is sometimes intentional from the perspective of business, it can create a confusion about what the business is doing in its core business and what it likes to talk about, what it likes to claim public credit for doing.
I'm a great fan of Christia's writing in general, but this article is completely the most ridiculous thing she's ever written. And the idea that in any sense BP's behaviour as a company drilling oil was affected by some smug fetishist going on in the boardroom, sitting there thinking, aren't we great and green, or the public won't notice that we're doing a terrible job.
The area that I think is the most dangerous around the corporate social responsibility discussion is it makes it easy for us to ignore, to be blinded to the moments when there is conflict between the interests of companies and the interests of the community.
You fail to acknowledge that corporate responsibility directly is related to, and in fact is most often inside of that very boundaries, inside of the culture of the company, the way it does business, the lines of business, how it chooses to invest, the products it chooses to pursue, the markets it chooses to pursue, how it does that. You call that good business. We call that responsible business.
At the surface, they're talking about CSR. But the bigger question is, what is the role of business in society? I think we should tackle that head on.
I want to extraordinarily thank our sponsors, Haley Center, BSR, and CSR Wire, and I want to thank Fenton, my employer, who was able to create this amazing event today.
Within CSR, there are 2 issues. On the one side, we have environmental issues, what I like to call the sexy sister. And on the other side, we have human rights issues, the stick your head in the sand and pretend it does not exist sister. Environmental issues affect everyone's quality of life, so they are top of mind and of interest to all. On the other hand, human rights violations are out of sight and out of mind. Let's face it, few individuals consider the working conditions under which their smartphone or the shirt on their back was manufactured. Today's presentation will focus primarily on the human rights component of corporate social responsibility. We will not be addressing environmental issues or the role of states and governments in protecting human rights. In many countries, developing countries, there are either no laws protecting workers or the laws are ignored. It is our stance that in these instances, multinational companies must step forward and do the right thing. In other words, protect the workers throughout their entire supply chain which is mandated in their codes of conduct. Professor Jeffrey Heel is the Paul Garrett Professor of Public Policy and Corporate Responsibility at Columbia Business School. In this presentation, he addresses Western companies operating overseas. Basically, it is at the company's discretion which laws and regulations they follow when conducting business offshore.
No attempt at all to implement the very bulk of environmental legislation in China. So in effect, if you're a Western company operating in China, it's up to you to decide whether to respect their legislation or not. There will be no penalties for not respecting legislation, environmental legislation. It's your choice. You can set your own environmental standards if you're operating in China. And the same thing goes obviously for the standards with which you apply to managing your labour force. There's minimum wage legislation, there's some health and safety at work legislation, but again, there's very little attempt to implement that. So if you're running a company in China, it's really up to you to pick your own standards. China's one case where you actually have legislation, but it's not implemented. There are other developing countries, obviously, where there simply is no legislation. And if you go around, let's set up a factory there, it's really up to you to decide what is a satisfactory sort of health and safety situation in the workplace, what is satisfactory environmental standards. You have to pick your own standards. And in particular, Western companies have to make a choice. They have to decide, should I operate, if I'm a US company, should I operate to US standards in China or in Vietnam, or should I operate to local standards? Should I take advantage of the fact that their standards are much lower than us? Or should I operate to the same standards I would in the US? And that's an interesting choice that they have to face. And different companies make different decisions in that area. There is a very interesting lawsuit going on at the moment. I'm sure some of you in the human rights area are familiar with this. It involves Chevron, or Chevron Texaco as it's called. And it's to do with their operations, the operations of their predecessor Texaco in Ecuador. Texaco drilled for oil in the Ecuadorian Amazon, in the rainforests, and in the process polluted groundwater very extensively. And that it's a long, complicated story, but I'm summarising it very briefly, and I guess probably rather full. But that obviously led to serious health problems for some of the indigenous peoples in the Amazonian region. Chevron is now being sued. Chevron then subsequently bought Texaco, and Chevron is now being sued by a variety of entities on behalf of them.
Professor John Ruggie is the Bertold Weitz Professor of International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. He is also the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Business and Human Rights. Professor Ruggie has been tasked with creating the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework for the United Nations, and he speaks here on the need for such a document.
More and more of the things we buy are produced by multinational corporations operating in many countries. But can we be sure these businesses and their suppliers respect the rights of workers and communities? John Ruggie is author of the UN's Protect, Respect and Remedy framework, which aims to ensure businesses uphold human rights.
How do multinationals fail to respect human rights?
Well, it can happen in any number of ways. For example, in the area of footwear and apparel, it's often overseas suppliers who don't adhere to recognized labor standards, don't pay overtime. In the area of extractive industries, mining and oil and gas, the problems often are in relation to communities in which the companies operate. Adverse impacts, whether it's environmental or otherwise. Communities protest. Protests escalate, security forces are called in, people get hurt, and the company ends up being accused of complicity in the harm that's done.
Why should business